Ireland follows. So wrote John Mitchell, the young Irelander. Tipperary has always been involved in the ancient fight in pursuit of freedom. The 32-county Irish Republic, as outlined in our most sacred of documents, the 1916 Proclamation. We stand here in a sacred place, alongside the bravest of the brave, our fallen Tipperary heroes of the IRA. The Tipperary Fenian John O'Leary stated, "The Fenian spirit is alive in Ireland and needs at any time but a little organisation to make it burst into renewed activity." The White Boys rebelled against British misrule here in Tipperary. The local landlords decided to grab some more land and clear the natives, to hell or to Connacht again. The Tipperary men said enough, and in true Tipperary spirit refused to accept the invader and their native hirelings grabbing land. And so, the White Boys agrarian movement was formed. Father Sheehy was a Fenian who stood with his people against the tyranny that was being inflicted on them. The Bagwells, Mauds and the descendants of Cromwell eventually got him on trumped-up charges and were paid perjurers. On the 15th of March 1766, Father Sheehy was hung, drawn and quartered, and his head placed on a spike. For 20 years his head was left there. Sean Tracy listed his execution as a national event that influenced him. Just out the road from here, but 100 years later, at Ballycoohey, on the 14th of August 1868, the small tenant farmers were dragged from their holdings by Scully the landlord and Crown forces, who as always stood by and ensured the croppies would lie down. And if they didn't, they would beat them down. But Tipperary men said no again, and the Scully's agent was killed and 4 policemen injured. Tipperary again had risen, and Tipperary's proud history of rebellion continued. The Fenians met on Slieve na Mon in 1798, keeping the flame of Fenianism glowing in Tipperary. In 1848, Tipperary men were again to the forefront. Charles Kickham and Tipp Town's own John O'Leary, leading figures in the movement. In 1867, a few miles from here, Tipperary Fenians made their stand at Ballyhurst, led by General Burke, a feathered man, and J.J. Miles Finnan of Ardvalan here just out the road from Tipperary town, playing a prominent role along with 4 of his 6 brothers. The Fenian Russell was killed and yet another rising was put down. But men like J.J. Miles Finnan, who saw action that day, although having to go on the run and be exiled, inspired the next generation by their actions and writings. So, into this proud tradition of Tipperary rebellions and Fenianism, the generation that successfully drove the British from Tipperary and removed the butcher's apron from flying over our towns and villages were born. The stories of J.J. Finnan and the Fenians from the Glen were told in the cottages and at the firesides. The horrendous stories also of the genocide inflicted on our nation, known today by sensible Ireland as the famine, would have been spoken of. No famine occurred along our boreens. Food was plenty, but Trevelyan and the Crown made sure the coffers of their planted landlords continued to grow, and food was exported from our isle under armed guard. The landlord class evicted as hard as they could, and the RIC and British Army made sure the King of England's law was enforced, while children starved and the cries of tortured parents echoed through our land as they were dragged from their homes. World War I came, and Britain's difficulties were Ireland's opportunity. Eamon O'Deal from Balloch was the main IRB man in South Tipp, and with Pierce McCann of Cashel and Frank Droe in Clonmel, preparations were made to rise. In Clonmel they gathered. Sean Tracy cycled these boreens, carrying messages. Dinny, Lacey and Paddy MacDonagh were part of the volunteers ready to rise here in Tipperary. The Galtee battalion met at Galbally, poorly armed but hoping for action. At Manor, at the foot of Slieve na Muck, halfway between Galbally and Tipperary, Michael O'Callaghan shot and killed 2 RIC men who had come to arrest him. Following an earlier incident, Sean Tracy had huge admiration for O'Callaghan, saying he had saved the name of Tipperary. The embers of republicanism and Fenianism were still burning in Tipperary. In October 1918, over PJ Maloney's chemist shop here in Tipperary town, the 3rd Tipperary Brigade of the IRA was formed. Within a few months, Tipperary men would again lead the way and take the fight to the British forces of occupation when the Salahead ambush took place. While the political movement met at the first stall, men from these hills and glens were waiting to ambush the enemy on a small boreen a few miles from where we stand today. Sensible Ireland and many so-called Republicans were horrified. From the altar here in Tipperary, the IRA were branded murderers. Tipperary was designated a special military area. Over the following years, Sean Tracy, Dan Breen, Seamus Robinson organised the IRA, going from parish to parish. When Sean was killed, Dinny Lacey took up the mantle and was a natural choice to lead the first flying column here in Tipperary. At Thomastown, Lisnagal, Gary Moore, in Kilkenny and Waterford, the tricolour flew high beside Dinny Lacey's column. Paddy MacDonagh, Vice Commandant, fought alongside Dinny throughout the war against the British and the Civil War. Paddy MacDonagh, a farmer's son from Lisfernan, who had received his BA degree from UCD, a gifted footballer, he epitomised all that was great about that brave generation of real Irishmen. Pat Boyce, Paddy's grandnephew, told me how when the Civil War was starting and Dinny Lacey was reorganising his column, he called to the MacDonagh home to talk to Paddy. Paddy was out in the field working. Dinny said to Paddy, "You never let me down before." Paddy stuck the spade in the ground and off he went to fight. Total loyalty and belief in a cause and his leader. Dinny led his men again in guerrilla warfare with Paddy alongside him, over hills and along boreens, through glens day and night. A National Army report printed by Hopkins described Dinny Lacey as the toughest leader which could be found in any part of Ireland. On the 18th of February 1923, while Dinny and Paddy sat saying the rosary in Rhines of Clara, the Free Staters, like Cromwell's mercenaries from years before, were descending in their hundreds on the lovely glen of Aherlow. History has a habit of repeating. Through this same terrain, the British hunted Father Geoffrey Keating, who the locals hid and saved. His crime was to save our Gaelic culture and write it down. Descendants of the same paymasters were also backing this hunt and kill operation. The ghosts of Maud and Bagwell were stalking the fields as 1,000 staters descended in their dyed British uniforms, clasping their British weapons. They had a lot to fear, and safety in numbers was probably the mantra. Men like Dinny and Paddy would not be afraid to stand and fight they did. When the glen fell silent at last, and darkness fell over the lovely fields of Ballydavid, yet again Ireland had lost a great freedom fighter, as Dinny Lacey was dead. Paddy would die a horrendous death within 24 hours, found by his own father Stephen the following morning, still in the wagon that had brought him to the barracks, a stream of blood trickling from it. Paddy was clinging to life after being left on his own with no treatment. Paddy MacDonagh's family suffered greatly for their republicanism. Paddy's 2 sisters, Julia and Marion, both Cumann members, were dragged off to jail within a few weeks of Paddy's death. Republican heartlands like Aherlow were raided now regularly. Tan terror was replaced by Free State terror. The MacDonagh home was visited by terror again within a few weeks, and darkness descended with the Free State killing Jerry Kiley as he tried to escape from a raid. Dan Breen was lucky that day to escape. No king's gold or power could divert men like Dinny Lacey and Paddy MacDonagh from their adherence to the principles of Pearson Clark. While former comrades scrambled for power, swore allegiance to foreign kings, were armed by the British paymasters, supported by the Anglo elite who were still clinging to power and containing many British Army recruits and other trucers that had stood idly by during the previous 2 years as the IRA men like Dinny and Paddy had brought the war to the British and fought them out of the hills and glens of Tipperary. On the same path, for the same cause which our martyrs of 1916 went to their unmarked graves, covered in quicklime for. The pursuit of freedom that led to James Connolly, strapped to a chair before being riddled with British lead. The same rocky path that had George Plant and Bobby Sands, Sean South die for their country's freedom because they stood by their principles. Recently, I heard a historian say the foundation of Fianna Fáil allowed the IRA to come down from the hills. Well, here in Tipperary, there were still men in them hills, up along through the decades, with George Plant, David Fitzgerald, Ned Carrigan, and many more continuing an unbroken tradition. Prefixes also became fashionable. The old IRA was now okay. The good old IRA. There was never an old IRA in my opinion, just the IRA. Dinny and Paddy's names are probably not... Dinny and Paddy's names are probably not spoken about in our schools even locally. As you will be told, it's better to move on and not dwell on the past. When the Free State declared war on the IRA that were defending the Republic declared in 1916, there was a difference in both sets of armies. One wore British khaki uniforms dyed green, fought with British weapons, were funded by the Crown, and were willing to bow and give allegiance to a foreign king whose soldiers had raped and pillaged our country since Cromwell's time for generations. The Free State Army was yet another group of armed men paid to enforce the laws of a foreign country on the island of Ireland. Like the yeomen of 98, they were paid, and like the United Irishmen, the IRA fought for their country and people. They were men of principles. The IRA stood against a foreign country's occupation of our isle and defended the Republic declared in 1916. Men like Dinny, Lacey and Paddy MacDonagh had principles and a true belief in our country's right to be free. They went to their graves too young, but we here in Tipperary will never forget Paddy and Dinny and all the great men of the IRA buried here. An old proverb says, a man is never truly dead until the last person who remembers him has finally forgotten. We must also never forget the sacrifices of families like the MacDonaghs and the Laceys and those great women of the safe houses, without whom the IRA could not have prosecuted their war in pursuit of freedom against tyrannical forces. There are those that deem it acceptable here in Tipperary to invite foreign monarchs while these same people claim jurisdiction over our 6 Irish counties. They wear their colonial symbols, promote their foreign culture and are too embarrassed to celebrate our great Republican heroes. But thankfully, there are still people who refuse to forget and refuse to accept the normalisation of British interference in our country. The people know who the real heroes are. Today, there are still Irish men and women prisoners in British prison cells in our country. This is a direct result of our country's colonial history. In the Dáil, on the 10th of November, just before Christmas, just gone, Eamon O'Queeve called the treatment of these prisoners as barbaric. It's easy for those in power to campaign against human rights abuses in faraway lands. They talk of other nations' sovereignty, while 6 of our counties remain under foreign occupation. Revisionism is alive and well. It's great to see such a slew more today to honour the great Dinny Lacey and Paddy MacDonagh and the brave men and women of the IRA who stuck to the 1916 principles. Buchas mór le dia, Tom Kinta goil she'd imaha slee na furna. In the words of Thomas Kent to finish, let him who feels shame for his ancestors' story be gone from our pathway, let ours be the glory. Go ma griv berbua.